welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon. Great to be here. I'd like to welcome expert educators Snowball and Keay, Cobbin. I know you are both accomplished educators who are at the forefront of connecting research with best teaching practice. You've had a great deal of experience teaching classrooms and developing your craft, professionally developing teachers in many settings, writing to publication. You've overseen some incredible growth in schools in literacy, engagement, love of learning and wellbeing in Australia and overseas. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Phil. It's really good to be doing this. It's such an important topic for people to get quite clear in their minds about what it's all about.
Absolutely, yeah.
And thanks for inviting me as well. I look forward to sharing some of my perspectives on reading, and I really hope that our listeners take something away that will influence their practice in a positive way.
And so we've got some really interesting questions today to help clarify things. So the first one is, currently there is a great deal being said and written about the science of reading by a range of educational communities, schools, universities, the media, and particularly social media. Can you talk to me about what the term science of reading actually means?
Yes, Phil, we do hear the term the science of reading being used by all of the groups you mentioned. And this is indeed a bit of a challenge for teachers and principals at the moment, because the term is being used differently according to a group's or an individual's perspective or interpretations and even motivation or purpose for how they're describing the science of reading. So some people would like you to believe their definition, which they use to support their own personal theory of how children learn to read, or even how young children should be taught to read. But I'm going to give you some definitions that are not mine. They're from publications of highly respected associations or educators who do not have a bias towards a particular view of reading. And I think that's very important. We're not looking for bias. And so listen carefully to the wording, because you'll find some of the same sorts of things coming up in different definitions. So the first of these I'll share with you is from the Australian Educational Research Organisation, and they say the science of reading refers to a large body of evidence that encompasses multidisciplinary knowledge from educators, linguistics, cognitive psychology, special education, and neuroscience about how children learn to read. And then a well-known academic, Tim Shanahan, argues that the science of reading is a set of conclusions and principles about how children learn to read, drawn from a substantial body of scientific study that has been carefully and publicly analysed without self-interest. And that's a very important part of that statement. And from the National Centre of Improving Literacy, the science of reading is a collection of research over time from multiple fields of study, using methods that confirm and disconfirm theories on how children best learn to read. So you can see, Phil, that the common thread from those quotes and what needs to be understood by everyone is that the science of reading is a large body of research that has contributions from a broad range of research interests.
Can I just add on there, Di, and I think it's pertinent right now to just refer to the Reading Research Quarterly Journal, and they actually devoted 2 complete editions to the science of reading. And as part of their research, the editors for these journals sought opinions on the science of reading. And it quickly became clear to them that there was no real single definition on the science of reading. And this understanding drove them to focus their editions not on actually setting which is the right side of the debate, but just to help us all, us, you, Phil, teachers, leaders, everybody involved in education, to develop a much better understanding and enable us to be more critical and capable consumers, and I like this point, and creators of information, always with the overall intention to move us forward. So I'd really encourage anyone who's keen to read from a broad range of perspectives on the science of reading to read those journals, the Reading Research Quarterly. I think there's probably about 16 to 17 articles in each of the editions, and that's volume 55, issue 1, 2020, September, and then followed up the following year, issue 2 in April. And there's some excellent articles that are written by educators and researchers who bring a broad range of perspectives to to this issue.
And that journal is published by the International Reading Association, highly valued. But all of the articles in both of those journals are free to anybody who wants to look at them. They're not just for members of the ILA. And that's wonderful that they have such open access to those very important articles.
And we can have links to those in the show notes for everyone. Sorry, Kay. Yep.
I just think that it's, when I talk to teachers, I encourage their school or themselves to become members of the ILA, because it's just got such rich information, current research. There's the reading teacher, there's the
Literacy Today.
Literacy Today. There's one, I just was reading it today. And then this morning I listened to a podcast by Peter Afflebeck on challenging readers, and it was terrific. And you can go back to that, or you could show up for a professional learning. It's just a wealth of information and knowledge.
It's been getting better in that way even. Yep. And one of their webcasts was fact-checking the science of reading that David Pearson and Rob Tierney conducted.
You watched that? You listened to that,
yes,
didn't you?
It was excellent, really excellent.
They have frequent webinars available, so they're just an incredible organisation, aren't they?
Definitely.
I was reading this morning that there's one for somebody's presenting about, and we'll talk a little bit more about this further on, but about the role of encoding in a phonics lesson.
Yes, yep.
So
yep. It gets down to quite specific details sometimes. Yeah, it's great.
Used to be the IRA, but we won't go there.
That always got us into a little bit of trouble when we said that.
Yeah.
You know. I'm glad they actually decided to change the name.
Yeah.
International Reading Association it was, yeah. Yep. Anyway, question 2. In the light of that important information we've just discussed, what do you think some of those misconceptions or misinterpretations are, and what challenges are they creating?
Well, I think we need to clarify, first of all, that the science of reading is not a program, but sometimes it is viewed that way because, our teachers are hearing it as though it is a program, and it's definitely not. And currently there's a trend to buy programs, which is a shame, but we need to be very critical because the quality of those programs varies. And the assumption is often made that all children are ready to learn the same thing at the same time. And that's definitely not what's recommended, especially in Victoria. The Victorian Literacy Toolkit just does not support that everybody's at the same place at the same time, which is very smart. And then Timothy Shanahan argues that the science of reading is not some individual's or company's vision of what they want to sell or what they want to do. So he's really putting his thoughts on the line about that. Some groups with a particular bias about how children learn to read, and also about how reading should be taught even, have claimed the science of reading for themselves, like it belongs to their idea about what reading is and not anybody else's. So in particular, I've noticed that those who think the most important thing to do in the teaching of reading is for the students to have a synthetic phonics program. They will often refer to the science of reading as though that term is synonymous with the term synthetic phonics. And this is definitely not true. They just, make everybody think that. And so people are starting to believe that's the way it is, but it's not.
The science of reading is a large body of knowledge, isn't it? It's not this,
Yep.
Some people have gone off and said, we're going to make a program and we're going to badge it with the science of reading as their name, but it's not linked at all.
No, not at all.
So it's almost like it's that sort of conflation of the term science of reading and the teaching of phonics. And it's a real challenge when we're working in schools and with teachers around that confusion of those particular terms. So I think that what's really needed here is some really significant professional learning for our teachers. Just like the Reading Research Quarterly, the ILA set out to establish an agreed interpretation of what we mean by the science of reading. So everybody, there's that common understanding. And I just wanted to add that I know in Victoria there are schools that actually advertise that they are a science of reading school. I just wonder, what does that mean? Does it mean that phonics is taught through a systematic synthetic phonics program in that school? Or does it mean that school actually uses a structured literacy approach? But the implication, which I'm very, very concerned about, is that school that advertises as a science of reading school is in some way doing it right, and any other school that's not doing it that way is in fact incorrect in their approach. And this binary approach that can be established works against building coherence in an education system. And for those people who've studied Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn, we know that's surely is where we want our education system to be. And the other thing that saddens me when I see this happening is that I think it erodes trust and respect between colleagues at all levels of the system. So we need to come to terms, we need to come together and really agree on what do we actually mean by the science of reading, and everybody needs to have the same understanding.
Exactly. And, it's not our opinion. It's, those definitions I've read before, we could have got hundreds of those from different associations saying exactly the same thing. It's not one person's point of view. It's a collection of broad knowledge, continuing for people to be learning about how children learn to read. And you can't just say, it's what I personally think, and you only need to believe me and no one else.
Yeah, and I think that binary approach of it's either this or that is so damaging for our education system. We are all educators together. We're all trying to solve these problems. We need to come together to solve them, not to say, we're in this camp or we're in this camp, because it's about having a whole range of strategies that we're going to use. But anyway, we're going to talk about those things a bit later.
Yeah.
Next question, is there anything else you'd like to add to our understanding of the science of reading?
Well, we need to remember and understand fully that the science is never settled. No science is ever settled and final, and that's it. Science is always the continued process of learning about our world through observation, experimentation, and research. And so it is with the science of reading. New knowledge is continually being added to this already huge body of knowledge, and it will continue to do so. Anyone who says the science is settled on teaching reading is in fact incorrect. And it's quite concerning. It concerns me that we've got people saying we're a science of reading school, but they're not actually looking at that body of research that they're supposed to be doing and thinking about what are we learning that's new. They might take something from 20 years ago and say, see that statement, that's it, and we're following that, and that's what you all have to do. If they're a real science of reading school, if they want to label themselves that, then they have to be up to date and following a broad range of research about it. And it's very easily obtained out there. You don't need to stay settled in something from 20 years ago at all.
My dad used to say, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
It's so true. For sure.
Yeah, he had a lot of sayings like that. I remember that one. Yep.
Good one.
Yep. Now, the next question. I understand that over time researchers have developed different models that represent the reading process. I guess that's an example of how science is always changing. Can you talk to us about some of these models and more recent findings or models that are spoken about in the science of reading?
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to talk to now is you're absolutely correct, Phil. I think this sort of does show and demonstrate how the science is continually changing and will continue to change. So there are different models that describe the reading process. And I think for this podcast, probably worthwhile to talk about the three that are most commonly referred to in education. But as we talk about these models, I think we need to be aware of how each one of them can certainly contribute and guide teachers in their practice. But on the other hand, we want our teachers to be aware of their possible limitations. So I want us to turn the clock back to 1986. And this was when the first model that I'd like to talk about was first proposed by Goff and Tumner. And this was the simple view of reading. And it was further detailed and tested in 1990 and later revised in 2020. Now, Goff and Tumner won't for any moment saying that this was simple because they acknowledged that the two components of their model were in fact complex. But interestingly, the simple view of reading is widely used to explain the science of reading and guide instructional practice. And in fact, Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright, who we'll refer to a little bit later on, in an article did a Google search, and the science of reading and the simple view of reading appeared together in websites of over 71,000 times.
Yeah, that's right.
So can you see where people are seeing, once again, they think science of reading, simple view of reading. The simple view of reading is not simple, but it just has two components. It shows that reading comprehension is not the sum of, but the product of two components, word recognition and language comprehension. And if either one of those is weak, reading comprehension is diminished. So such that no amount of skill in one component can compensate for the lack of skill in the other. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the simple view of reading, that it was actually developed at a time when there was a real pushback around whole language. And Goff and Tumner, which is another incredible thing to see this journey of reading over the years.
Yeah.
But Goff and Tumner saw the need to raise the profile of teaching phonics explicitly. And I don't think it can be denied, and no one in research would deny that they made a significant contribution, to the discussion around reading. And there's been subsequently a huge body of research that supports the two components of their model. And originally it was decoding and listening comprehension. It's since been rephrased to word recognition and language comprehension. But Goff and Tumner's model separated out those two components, which unfortunately can give a message to educators that those two things need to be taught separately and sequentially. And in some instances, they should do a 50-50 split. So this is impacting on practice. When you read about it, the fact that it's being so closely aligned with the science of reading, that to me is the concern. So I've asked teachers to give definitions to me. So I'll say, what do you think the science of reading means? And sometimes it's the simple view of reading they're explaining.
Right.
So this all goes back to content knowledge.
Yeah.
Our teachers need to understand what this model is. They need to understand the two components, because if we fast forward to 2001, Scarborough developed what was called the Scarborough reading rope. And I think it was quite clever. She likened the reading process to two strands of a piece of rope, one strand being word recognition, the other strand being language comprehension. And as the reader became more proficient, those two strands came together. So very similar to Goff and Tumner's model, but Scarborough, what she did was she elaborated on what were the subcomponents to each strand. So
yeah, it gave a lot more detail to both of them, which was very, very helpful at the time.
Very important for teachers to understand what those components were under each of the strands. And it gave the clear message that neither decoding nor meaning are sufficient by themselves. But once again, the limitation of the model is that gap between where the two components are separate and when they gradually come together.
Yeah.
So now we can fast forward even up to 2021, and I just want to talk very briefly to the active view of reading. And this is probably the most recent model that our teachers, I think, need to be really aware of. And this was developed by Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright, and they argue that their model reflects the more recent findings from the research. So the model itself still includes the same two components of word recognition and language comprehension, with subcomponents slightly different to the ones in the Scarborough's reading rope. But the key difference here is that it presents those two processes as overlapping. Think of a Venn diagram. And it explicitly identifies processes that bridge these constructs. And these bridging processes include reading fluency, vocabulary knowledge, morphological awareness, graphophonological, semantic, cognitive flexibility. That's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's letter, sound, meaning, flexibility. So that's a real advance.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why she calls it beyond the simple view of reading from the previous two models. And the other key difference between the other two models I've just spoken to and the active view of reading is that the active view of reading includes self-regulation skills, motivation and engagement, executive function, and strategy use. And these kinds of self-regulation processes really help readers to actively manage their word reading, their language comprehension, and then coordinate these processes while reading. So a big step in an advanced direction. I think the other really important point that we want our listeners to understand about the active view of reading is that it helps teachers, and I'm doing a little bit of this work right now, to perhaps understand or get to the bottom of working with students who have age-appropriate word recognition and language comprehension, but they're still not comprehending. Yeah. And this is a big frustration for a lot of teachers. This student can read anything in front of them, but when it comes to actually deep comprehension and deep understanding, it's not explained. So I think that that's a really important advance that we can think about. But like I've expressed about the previous limitations, and I need to say that Duke and Cartwright acknowledge that it's a very new model and that there are limitations with their model and it requires more research. And they also state that their model has not been tested as a whole at this particular point, but each component in the model is supported by significant research that component actually contributes to reading. So it's a very exciting model. I'm actually quite excited about it, Phil.
Yeah. It's a real bridge between where we didn't have that bridge before.
It is. And I think that when you think about it, we're talking about their model coming out recently, in fact, a couple of years ago. Yes. It's already become something that could be superseded, that I'm sure they've been doing further research in those 2 years for sure. But it's, when you think about how many years since that first view of reading came out, the simple view of reading, yes, and now we're talking about, 35 years yes. or something? Mm-hmm. So, of course, there's been a lot more learned, and we have to be really cognizant of that in teaching. And, it's not easy to keep up with everything as a teacher because, reading is one aspect, but there's many other aspects of the teaching of children that they have to keep up with.
I really admire these researchers who are so clever in what they're finding out for us. But why is this research information so important for teachers?
Well, if we're talking about these models, Phil, I just think that they're a great starting point, or not a starting point, maybe teachers, building point for a lot of teachers around. I mean, to be an effective teacher, you have to have strong content knowledge. And so for me, or for us, they provide that content knowledge that is required. We need pedagogical content, and then we need literacy pedagogical knowledge. But I sort of think about these models a bit like making a cake. And the components are the ingredients that go into the cake. But the key here is that they don't tell teachers about the amount of each ingredients and how to make the cake.
Oh, okay. Yep.
I was sort of reading about from a psychologist, Mark Seidenberg, and he makes this point about reading models. And he states that they're a great starting point, but it's a bad ending point. And I think that's a really important thing for us to understand, that we need to certainly build that understanding of each of the models, but we need to do a lot of work with teachers about the when and the how. And I agree that we need to be rigorous in supporting teachers to translate that theory into practice. It's almost a moral imperative of our education systems. And Seidenberg even goes on to say that if we don't do it, somebody less skilled will jump in and do it for us.
Or even just someone with a very strong bias will jump in and do it for us. And, people follow very easily because, they're not a single teacher by yourself. You don't feel strong enough to stand up to something. Even if you think, with the children I teach, something about this doesn't make sense or doesn't seem completely right. So, we shouldn't leave these gaps. We need to really think about how do you transfer it into practice. But, that's what our work is all the time. That's why we're, after, 56 years for me and 40-something years for you,
yes,
why we do so much work out in the classroom. That's where we find out, working with kids, not every child's the same, what will work here, what will work there, and, how do we keep making use of this knowledge to put into practice? How do you teach? I don't think Nell Duke ever goes to sleep because she's working at this sort of stuff all the time. I think it sounds a bit like you and me, actually.
Yeah, possibly.
But so thorough, and morally they know that they have to keep working at making sure it actually all works in the classroom, that it's not narrow, and that all of these components need to work together in some way, and that it's not going to be a formula, because what works with one child won't necessarily work with another.
No.
And I think it's almost a problem with the writing of curriculum even, because you have to be careful not just to say, well, everybody needs to do exactly this. And some of the state curriculum are very demanding about an exactness.
Yes.
And it can actually be quite detrimental for some kids. So we've all got to be working so hard at this, because learning to read affects people's lives. And so we just can't let people ride over us, if they're biased in their view or they don't know enough or whatever.
And we've got many, many expert practitioners that have been doing this and getting better and better for decades, and they're the ones we should be turning to, like master craftsmen.
Yep, definitely. There are plenty of really great teachers out there, not recognised enough. There's a lot of teacher bashing, in fact. So,
the other thing about that, I think, if you've got a really strong content knowledge around those models, and you know each one of them, it gives you some agency in your work. It gives you the opportunity to look at a student that maybe is really baffling you, and you're thinking, you know what, and maybe a struggling student, actually I prefer to say a challenged reader, and maybe at the end of primary school going into secondary, they've probably had a heavy diet of intervention that hasn't worked. So this active view of reading, particularly self-regulation, I think there's just so much more, which I'll talk to a little bit later, but I just think it just gives teachers options to say, well, you know what, I'm going to explore more about this student. It could be one or two or three areas of that, but often when we see an older student that's challenged, they go into a phonics program. They go older phonics program, and it could well be that is not it might be for a couple of students, it could be exactly what they need, but it's not for all students. And you're absolutely right. There's not one child that all children are going to be individuals, and they're all going to have their own specific needs.
Yeah.
And we need to be skilled enough to know exactly where we need to look when we watch that student read and listen to that student read and we see what they write, to know where we need to target the intervention.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be just thinking about challenged or struggling children, because I worry also about kids who start school being able to read. And, I've got several of them, but not of my own children, but, godson's children and friends' children or whatever, who are so competent at reading before they start school. And I worry myself sick about what some of them are going to be given to read when they start. You know, some of them in some states are not even allowed to have a book when they start school until they pass some phonics test or something. So, you know, I worry just as much about those kids. We've got to know everything about all of them.
And developing that content knowledge with the teachers, I was going to say we're here to provide links to podcasts or resources, because there must be teachers that are listening to us saying, well, how do I develop that content knowledge? You know, where do I go? I'm really stuck. So ILA is great, and as we go in the podcast, we'll have more information too.
But also, you know, you've already got a lot of fabulous podcasts on your website, and I know that you're going to start some courses. I think that they're really great sources of information, because it's harder to find time to read than to listen to a podcast that you can listen to over and over again, even while you're doing other tasks that you don't have to concentrate on too much. Like when I'm doing the housework or something like that, I'm always listening to a podcast or the listening part of a webcast. So
it's so different to the early part of our careers when we had to go to a conference and had to go to a workshop. Now you can do an online course and you can pause it and go back to it at another time, and it's all so different now, the access.
Yeah.
Well, I know I'm going to go back to because I'm doing some work with some around challenged readers in senior primary and junior secondary. And I know I'm going to go back to, I told, all the participants, I gave them that link to that, Peter Afflerbach's podcast this morning. But I know as an educator, I'll go back to that.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'll just really pull out. And then people had put links into the chat. So I copied all those links into the chat. And then I'll just, so you can follow one thread to another to build your knowledge.
You start off thinking you're just going to listen to something or read something, and then you're off on so many other avenues because of what's mentioned in that. It's fabulous.
Great. Great discussions. So the next question, could we just unpack a couple of the components that are represented in all or some of the three models? Let's start with word recognition and narrow that down to teaching of phonics, which we all know is hotly debated at the moment. We probably all know that the NRP, the National Reading Panel, made some clear statements about the teaching of phonics. What would you like our listeners to learn and think about in this area?
Yeah, okay. I'll start by talking about that. If you don't know, some of you who are listening, that the National Reading Panel report came out in 2020.
In the US.
Yeah. And these are some of the things that were actually said or written about in that report that we need to think about. The first one is experts caution against forgetting that at its core, phonics is a means to an end. Programs that focus too much on the teaching of letter-sounds relations and not enough on putting them to use are unlikely to be very effective. Now, I see this quite often, that teachers, I think in the main, really know that they've got to be teaching the children how to use sound-symbol relationships for reading and for writing. But they may not demonstrate that when they're doing shared reading or shared or interactive writing. And also they may not even go on and make the statement to the kids, that's something you can do when you're independently reading or writing. So the kids really know that this teacher isn't just doing this today because she woke up and thought about it, but she actually wants me to learn about it and learn how to use it for myself as a reader and a writer. So that's, okay, you can teach something, but do the kids know how to make use of it?
Yeah, having that time for independent reading and writing is crucial, isn't it?
It is, but you need to know what to do during that time.
Yeah.
Come better at it. And, to me, that's what the explicit part of teaching is. It's getting right down to telling kids, this is how you can use this in order to become a better or more effective reader and writer.
Yep.
And that's explicit. So the kids really know that's the case.
Yep.
Also, they said it's important to emphasise that systematic phonics instruction should be integrated with other reading instruction to create a balanced reading program. That's their words. Phonics instruction is never a total reading program. Phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it nor in the significance attached. It's important to evaluate children's reading competence in many ways, not only their phonics skills, but also their interest in books and their ability to understand information that's read to them. By emphasising all of the processes that contribute to growth in reading, teachers will have the best chance of making every child a reader. Now, all of that statement was from the National Reading Panel. And, of course, having written that in the year 2000, we now even know more about all of those statements because of more research taking place. So in some quite specific aspects that were thought about then, we could even go much further right now.
But that was a huge document at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of research went into that.
And a lot of people involved in that research from many walks of life in education. But even though that's the case, there was still a lot of criticism about it didn't include enough from a broad enough area and what was known about. So I think by the time something is written, it's already superseded or built on, probably, rather than superseded in some way.
I heard they didn't have the funding to study all the areas they wanted to study. So,
right.
Yep.
Really?
Yep.
I didn't know.
And they were given a specific amount of time to get it finished by. Usually with those sorts of things in any walk of life, it's not as complete as you would like it to be.
But I think that what you just said, Di, is important, that those 5 areas that were identified by the National Reading Panel stand true today, but it was in 2000.
That's right.
And so, again, what we know so much more now.
And what Keay's talking about is they identified as the 5 major components to help children learn to read successfully were phonemic awareness, phonics, comprehension, vocabulary and fluency.
Right.
Now, of course, we still know all of those areas are important. How much is required by a particular child in any one of those areas? If a child's already reading, for example, are you going to spend a lot of time on phonemic awareness?
I don't think so.
They're past being able to hear sounds in
language. They need to do something much more sophisticated than that.
But, definitely a school in their planning have to take all of those 5 into account to this day. But we know so much more about each one of those areas. And, I mean, even phonemic awareness, the research on that at the time was being done with small groups of children.
Right.
And they only did it for a short amount of time. And some people have transferred that into whole class teaching, and perhaps they need to rethink that. And, some places it's almost legislated that you've got to do it with every child instead of finding out whether they need it or not. So, that growth happens sometimes quite quickly, or misinterpretations can happen.
I was just sort of thinking about when you were talking around just even vocabulary. I mean, what the wealth of information that's out there around, teaching vocabulary and the importance of vocabulary at every year level.
Yeah,
for
sure.
From foundation all the way up to, continuing into right into the senior secondary schools. And there's just so much that we can teach our teachers around how to teach vocabulary explicitly, all of that work. There's a rich bank of resources and books that are written. I don't know whether you know Quigley's work on vocabulary. It's brilliant, Yeah,
there are so many. I mean, Isabel Beck,
McEwen.
Yeah, so many of them. But, again, the word vocabulary, you have to think of how broad that term is when you're planning on what you're doing with children, because it's not a matter of just adding to their known vocabulary, as in knowing the meaning of words and phrases or metaphors, etc. But it also means that they have to learn as a reader. If I come to a word I don't understand the meaning of, I need to do something about it probably.
Yes.
And even knowing, do I need to do something about it or not, is an important self-regulatory decision to make. If I'm still figuring out easily what this is all about, perhaps it's not essential that I know what every single word means, but you've got to be thinking about, have I got the right gist about all of this or not? If not, what will I do about it? If I don't know the meaning of a word, how do I find out? Because we know just going to a dictionary is not the best thing to do. So we know that the students need other resources in order to get rich information about the particular meaning of a word, even in this context, because it could mean something different.
But
in
I'm
another
thinking,
context.
as you're talking, Di, I'm thinking how going back to the active view of reading and one of those bridging processes of vocabulary, but more philological awareness.
Exactly.
And if teaching those, the morphology of the English language from foundation, so that students have a strategy to get inside a word, so that they can actually, if they can see those morphemes in a word, it can really help them to get to the meaning, because context is not going to work for many words.
No, that's right.
So you have to have, and can't have them running to the dictionary, but all the time, but
it won't help them.
So we've
much.
learned a tremendous lot about vocabulary, and we need to really.
But not forgetting this whole notion about how do I find out the meaning of an unknown word. I don't always see that being written about when someone's talking about how do you build vocabulary and build knowledge. Well, then you've got to think about what do I do in my reading that relates to how the vocabulary might be influencing my understanding. What will I do if I don't know what it means? And when you say right from the beginning of school, it probably does happen from before school when kids are speaking. They ask their parents, what does that mean?
Yes.
A lot of them, don't they? We know that from just watching kids. But apart from just asking other people, to teach the morphology, I even help kids to think about, if I know how to read or write hat, how do I read or write hats?
Yes.
And, already I'm adding on a morpheme to the base word, and I will use that language. Kids can understand whatever language we want them to know through the context. Just like some parents call a train a choo-choo. Well, why not call it a train? Because the kids then get the vocabulary. So, but we need to build on that base word. How do you add prefixes and suffixes? Because this is such an important part of how the English language works. And it will help you with meaning, it will help you with spelling, it will help you with reading. The older kids get to longer words and they don't know how to look at the word in terms of base word. Go back to that. I'm adding a prefix or I'm adding a suffix or perhaps multiple of them. And if I work through those, then it will help me to spell them. It will definitely help me to read them. So it's more than just syllables.
And many more words with that same base. So
exactly.
You've unlocked a whole lot of more vocabulary, haven't you?
Exactly. You're building on it. And that's, you're always looking for those opportunities to build rather than keep it narrow.
But can I just, when we talk about that, I think it's just good, just a gentle reminder to go back to, well, what did the National Reading Panel say here? It says, as Di expressed, it said that we need to have a balanced reading program.
Yeah.
So if phonics is going to be the dominant component of a phonics program, we have to be looking to say, well, when do we find time to teach vocabulary? And it can't be on the run. It has to be planned, and it has to be really clear about what words we're going to use, and using those words as a means to an end so we can learn lots of new words. So I just think that word balanced reading program is a really important point for our people to be thinking about, because we need to ensure we've got vocabulary as a key. We're talking reading. Vocabulary is a vital element in successful reading.
Definitely, yep. And of course, this is influenced incredibly by what you read and what is read to you.
Yes.
Because, there's oodles of research about most of the vocabulary that you are adding to your word knowledge is coming from what you're reading. So if you're reading a very narrow range of books, and even some kids, they can get really hooked on a series, and that might be fantastic for that time because it's getting them into the habit of reading and they're enjoying reading. But then you have to be able to show them what to read as well as that they'll enjoy just as much, because some of those authors of the series will just use the same vocabulary over and over again. So there's many parts to all of this to think about. How do you keep that improvement going? Also, if the books they're reading have very simple words in them only, even from when they're 5, then that's how limiting their vocabulary development's going to be.
Thanks, Keay and Di. Such rich conversations. We'll have a break there and bring back the conversation in part 2 next week. And thank you to all of you, our listeners. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Keay Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Keay can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.